Hello everybody, and welcome to week one of Humanities 101, history of art, music, literature, culture, all that good kind of fun stuff. And I'm Professor Curran once again. So lots of stuff to talk about this week. It's kind of challenging sometimes. I'll be writing on the board. Please feel free to take notes, which you can just use and can bring that next week when we're actually in class. But anyway. Let's begin with an assessment of, first off, what is culture? Okay, that's kind of what we're talking about here. And by the way, forgive me if I'm moving around a little bit, kind of getting out of the screen, but I tend to walk around a lot. What is culture? Is culture learned? Is culture inherited? Lots of different theories on that. Carl Jung, for example, the great psychologist, thought that there was something he called a collective unconscious, that there were certain traits that were innate to all human beings. Most people will argue that culture is learned behavior, and that culture includes a number of things that we're going to talk about in this class. What do human beings have in common? Like, what is their culture? They include things like language, religion, economic systems, political systems, shared values, conflict, architecture, music, all of which will play a critical role in some of the things we're going to talk about today. So how do human beings get from being, and I don't mean this in a pejorative term, primitive civilizations to where they are today? So let's begin our assessment of culture by looking at some of the key events that helped shape human history. Certainly one of the most important events, and there are a number of what I would call game-changing events in the story of humanity. The first is probably the invention of fire. The invention of fire was critical for a number of reasons. One, human beings who biologically have very few defenses against predators. We don't have claws, we're not large, we can't fly. So how do we defend ourselves against predators? The mastery of fire was critical because it is one of the few elements on Earth that is universally feared innately by all other creatures. So fire gave us a huge element of protection. It also allowed us to do something really unique too, that is cooking our food. Why was the cooking of food such a critical element in the human story? The cooking of food was critical for a number of things, but what cooking of food does, when you cook something, when you cook meat, for example, it begins to break down the chemical processes in the food. Okay? Why that is critical is then you don't have to do it in your stomach because it's already started to break down. That enabled humans through evolution to have smaller stomachs. Smaller stomachs allowed for the creation of larger brains. If you look at animals in the wild, cows for example, have huge stomachs, because they have to process. If you take food in and you have to break it down from its original elements inside of your stomach, it takes a lot of time, takes a lot of space. The cooking of food allowed human beings to, in essence, evolve to a point where we had smaller, flatter stomachs, although that may not be as true today, and larger brains. So that was a critical element. Another huge game changer for us, and I think it's a critical element when we talk about culture. And we about 9,000 years ago comes the agricultural revolution. That was a huge issue. Why was agriculture so important? Okay, prior to the agricultural revolution, this probably started in the Middle East somewhere, that somebody figured out that you could actually plant seeds and they would grow. But agriculture was critical. Prior to agriculture, how do human beings feed themselves? Well, you were hunters and gatherers, right? So what? What's wrong with hunting and gathering? Nothing really, except if you are a hunter or gatherer, as a species, as a people, do you have culture? Maybe a little bit. You got some elements of culture. But can you have civilization? And the answer is probably not. Because if you are a hunter-gatherer society, you spend the vast majority of your day doing what? Well, hunting and gathering. If you're a male, you're out hunting mammoths or whatever it is you hunt all day long. And if you're a female, you're out gathering berries, taking care of children all day long. What the agricultural revolution did, and it really is a revolutionary thing, the agricultural revolution allowed for the creation of a food surplus. See, with a hunter-gatherer society, there may be food surpluses. Kill a mammoth? Yay. But food surpluses are not predictable in hunter-gatherer societies. So you have to consistently hunt and gather because you don't know. Agriculture allows you, to a larger degree, a predictability of food. And if you have a predictably large surplus of food, or at least a surplus of food, it allows for something else unique. And that, my friends, would be this. Specialization of labor. Specialization of labor was critical for the development of civilizations. All those things we talked about that were critical elements of civilization. Religion, well, somebody's got to be the priest or whatever. Art, somebody's got to be painting and sculpting. Music, somebody's got to be playing music. Literature, somebody's got to be writing poetry, okay? All that sort of stuff requires something. Time. You had to have time. Specialization of labor, created by the food surplus. If there's a surplus of food, you have more time to do things other than hunt and gather. So as human beings learn to domesticate crops and learn to raise crops and have agriculture, it allowed for specialization of labor. It also allowed for permanence of civilizations. Hunter-gatherer societies follow herds. You've got to follow the food source. Well, if the food source is relatively permanent on a relatively stable, fertile piece of land, then the dwellings become permanent. And that led to all sorts of interesting and at the same time challenging cultural, civilization-related aspects to us, or for us. As dwellings became permanent, people needed to protect them from raiders and people who would take their stuff. So you had the development of cities, the development of fortified cities, the development of armies, and all the things that we take for granted and see as part and parcel of our own civilization today really find their roots 9,000 years ago or so with the development of agriculture. Okay? So we understand how important that can be. Now, let's take a look, if we can, at some of the early civilizations and some of the contributions that they made. And we're going to begin by talking about what is generally regarded as the first civilizations. And again, that's a term some will use for others, other types of groups of people, but for our definition of what a civilization is, we will begin by discussing an area known as Mesopotamia. Where is Mesopotamia? Well, quite frankly, it's in modern Iraq. You want to know where civilization started? That's where it was, at least in the Western context. Mesopotamia was referred to as the land between two rivers. There were two primary water sources, the Tigris River and the Euphrates River. Now, what made that kind of cool is you had these two rivers, right, flowing through, and the area between them is referred to as the Fertile Crescent. The area between the two rivers is relatively fertile land, so you can grow crops there. Okay? So what develops in Mesopotamia then is the first large-scale civilization where people begin to settle down, relatively fertile land, grow some crops, and begin to build those elements of stable structures, cities, literature, art, music, religion, all those things that we come to feel are part of civilization today. And there are a number of important things that happen in Mesopotamia that have really important impact for future civilizations. And one of the things you really want to take away from this course is we tend to look at ancient civilizations, and we throw the word primitive out there, and I don't know that that's really the case. These cultures, I don't know if people really honestly are that different today than they were 5,000 years ago. You still need food, you still need clothing, you still need shelter. Those basic needs. How we manifest those needs really has changed, but the basic needs of humanity, I don't know have changed that much. And what's fascinating about these people is with limited tools, limited resources, these people were able to create some fascinating and really quite sophisticated levels of society, and that's kind of what we're going to talk a little bit about today. So one of the first major innovations was the development of writing. The development of writing, as we understand it, really occurs in Mesopotamia, and the first form is called cuneiform. And cuneiform basically was a writing system of little markings on clay tablets that look kind of like this, on like a baked clay tablet. An early form of writing. And why was writing such a hugely important element in the development of civilization? And everybody will tell me a lot of things that, yes, it allows us to understand history, although some cultures had oral histories, and they passed that down, and that was kind of useful. Writing was useful for a number of things. Again, certainly understanding our culture, having a history, for learning, for education, those were hugely important. There's another really important thing that writing allowed to flourish, and that was business, commerce. Commerce thrives on writing. All businesses must have records. Who do I owe money to? Who owes me money? What's in my inventory? Where am I going to sell things? So without that, imagine if you had a business today, no writing, no records whatsoever, no emails, no filing cabinets, it would be impossible. You could have a small, like one-person business maybe, but without writing, commerce, trade, and all those things that really make civilization flourish and make it a wondrous thing that it is, was predicated on our ability to write. And so the development of writing, which was, again, such a critical element for it, allowed civilizations in this area to really take the next step and become just amazingly diverse, amazingly prosperous for that period of time. So cuneiform, hugely important step forward. Now, with the advent of writing in Mesopotamia comes another interesting innovation that we should take some time to talk about, and that is the development of law. Human beings, when they began to have permanent settlements, and even prior to that, there were always leaders, followers within hunter-gatherer societies, but as cities developed, small cities at first, more and more people coming into cities, how do you organize the cities? Who's in charge? And what are the rules? And that becomes really important. You cannot have a large civilization without some set of rules. And in the old days, prior to this, rule was pretty much by who was the strongest, who was the toughest. And that could change from day to day. And if that changes from day to day, that leads to a great deal of uncertainty. Uncertainty is not good for business, it is not good for culture, it is not good for civilization. If you don't know and you can't plan, it makes it really, really difficult to figure out what you're going to do, okay? And whether or not you want to stay in that city. If the rules change daily, it's really difficult to have any sense of continuity and permanence there. So along comes a king in this area, and a civilization that grows up here is referred to as the Babylonians. There are a number of civilizations that grow up in Mesopotamia. The Sumerians, the Akkadians, and eventually the Babylonians. And the Babylonians have this cool king, and his name is Hammurabi. And you're going to want to know about Hammurabi. He's a real important figure because he's the first guy in recorded history. He's the king. And the king, he writes up a law code. Okay? It's called the Code of Hammurabi. It is the first written law code in recorded human history. Okay, so what? Why is a law code such a critical element, a critical thing? It really was, again, it's a game changer for this reason. What does a law code do? Who does a law code benefit? Now, a lot of people will tell me it benefits the rich and the powerful. I would argue that's not true. In fact, no laws benefit the rich and powerful. Why? Because they're rich and powerful. What laws do is they restrain the powerful. Now, Hammurabi's law code may seem harsh, like if you steal, cut off your hand, commit adultery, cut off some other body part. So, but without that, if there is no law code and I have power over you, what stops me from doing anything I want to you? And the answer is nothing. And what's fascinating about Hammurabi's law code, by the way, even though it may seem harsh, and there's some passages from it in your textbook, over half the laws in his law code all deal with business and commerce, by the way. That is another thing that is necessary. Writing was necessary for business. And enforceable contracts was another element that was absolutely necessary for business to flourish. And Hammurabi's law code, I think, recognized this, because in human history, right now at this time, we're kind of, we kind of learn as we go. And we're seeing for the first time now people trading, people, buying on credit per se, and those types of exchanges. And if there's no such thing as an enforceable contract, business is unlikely to flourish. If I agree to sell you 5 goats or whatever for a couple bags of silver, and I give you the goats and you don't give me the silver, who do I complain to? What do I do? If you have no mechanism to rectify that, I am unlikely to engage in trade again. And I think Hammurabi probably recognized this and said, you know what? We need to figure out a way so that everybody's on the same playing field and that rules are applied to everybody. And his law code, as I said, it seems harsh, almost draconian by today's standards. Punishments were severe. But again, without any sort of system, it is always, hold on, coffee, fine. Sorry about that. It is always the rich and powerful that can do what they want. So any type of laws, even though they probably strike harsher on the poorer and less empowered elements of Babylonian civilization, it still gave them some recourse. There are some things people simply cannot do to you. Okay? So the law code of Hammurabi, absolutely critical development in the history of civilization. Now, as these civilizations began to develop, one of the other critical elements of civilization was the development of literature, which was obviously writing needed to come before that. And the first great literary work in Western history was this. It was Gilgamesh. I just bought a copy of that. My son asked for it for Christmas. How about that? 15 years old, says, Dad, I want to read Gilgamesh. Good for him. Gilgamesh is a hugely important thing to read. First epic piece of literature ever in Western human history. Okay? Why is it so important? Much of what follows in literature, in writing, etc., is predicated on this. There's fascinating stories in Gilgamesh. And Gilgamesh is a story about this guy, Gilgamesh, who goes through a series of adventures, and it portrays the Babylonian, the Mesopotamian concept of what life was like and what the afterlife was like. And later traditions would borrow interesting aspects from this. For example, there's a fascinating story in the Epic of Gilgamesh about, see if this story sounds familiar to you. There's a big flood, right? Destroys everything except this one cool guy and his family who build a boat, right? And they survive the flood and they populate mankind after that. Where have I heard that? Ah, yes. The biblical story of Noah may be the first example of academic plagiarism recorded in history. It's stolen, literally. Substitute the Babylonian names for Noah and his family, and that's what it is. Because everybody knew the story. This was such an important work that the story of Gilgamesh and some of the elements of it were so familiar that later writers, in order to tell their stories, would take these things which everybody knew about, which were culturally ingrained at that point in time, and make it their own. So the early Christians took the story of Gilgamesh, that part of it anyway, about the flood, and made it their own. But the roots of that story are not Christian in origin. They go way back to the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is where it talks about this great flood. But anyway, there's a number of other interesting aspects to the story. Again, and it tells us a little bit about what life was like. And basically, and I think there may be one of the discussion questions on this that we'll talk about a little bit later. The Mesopotamian civilizations have a relatively gloomy outlook on life and death. If you read Gilgamesh, he goes through, he's trying to figure out what life is all about and what happens after death and his relationship with the gods. He meets this one guy, his name is Enkidu, and he and Enkidu become great friends. And they fight this great bull of heaven. They slay the bull. And the gods in their anger strike Enkidu down dead. And Gilgamesh is devastated by this. And really what Gilgamesh is all about is that fundamental human question that virtually all civilizations and cultures, and this is played out in literature all the time, our own mortality. How do we understand the concept of death? Are we in fact temporary beings? And if we're temporary beings, is there any meaning to existence? And if there is something beyond this life, what is it? And really, Gilgamesh goes through a series of encounters after the death of his friend Enkidu, searching for immortality. And in the end, he rejects immortality. And he discovers, in essence, his own humanity in doing so. But the Mesopotamians have, as I said, a relatively gloomy look about life and the afterlife. Now, that is probably predicated on a number of things. Why would a civilization assume, life is basically sad and gloomy and it sucks, and then later, when you die, the afterlife kind of sucks? There's a number of theories as to why. My personal hunch is that a lot of society's outlook deals with their ability to get food. Large food surplus, happy people. Small food surplus, nervous people. No food surplus, gloomy people. And although Mesopotamia is a relatively fertile region, its flooding is unpredictable, it does generate food, and it is fertile, but it is not nearly as predictable as other parts of the world. So you never knew from one season to the next, one time to the next, whether there would be food or there would not be. So life was tenuous then. Life was dangerous. And because of that, I think people developed a mindset that kept them a little bit on edge. What was life really like? Was it safe? Was it good? And then how does that relate to death? And in the Mesopotamian, Babylonian vision of the afterlife, it is a pretty gloomy place. It is dark. It is forbidding. It is not like filled with wonder or, and they don't really have the modern Judeo-Christian concepts of some heaven and hell. It's just a dark, gloomy place. Okay? Now, in contrast to that, let's take a look at one of the other great civilizations of that period. And that, of course, would be the rise of Egypt. Egypt, as you know, is predicated on the River Nile, one of a handful of rivers on the planet that flow northward, by the way. Why is the Nile such a big deal? Well, the Nile is a huge river. Okay? And the Nile, unlike the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia, the Nile floods relatively predictably every year. Why is a flood such a good thing? And for the people of Egypt, the flood was a wondrous thing. Because what does flooding do? When a river floods, it pulls up all the bottom stuff in the river, the silt and all that other stuff, throws it over the banks onto the land. Why is that good? Well, that stuff is fertile. It's taking fertilizer, all that organic material that settles at the bottom of the river, throws it all up, and throws it on the banks of the river. So in essence, the soil on either side of the Nile River was like super soil. And Egypt is one of the, rarely do they have a food issue there. Egypt becomes, in essence, literally the breadbasket of the ancient world. The Romans would fight wars over Egyptian grain. So food is not a major problem for the Egyptians. Huge surplus of food. So, and Egypt is also, so again, the elements that you need for civilization. Food surplus, check. The other advantage the Egyptians have is geography. On either side of Egypt, to the east or to the west, you know what they got? Desert. Well, that's kind of good in a way, because if you're going to attack Egypt, if you're going to plunder Egypt, unlike Mesopotamia, which was wide open to invaders from all sorts of directions, relatively flat, relatively easy access, so you would have a number of civilizations in Mesopotamia that rose and fell, were conquered and conquered in turn. Okay? But Egypt is relatively protected on both sides by large, difficult to pass deserts. So, food surplus, check. Relatively stable, check. All the elements are in place for the development of a great civilization. And Egypt is one of the greatest and longest lasting civilizations of all times. They have a profoundly large impact on a number of areas regarding civilization. And of particular importance to us this week, as we talk about the development of culture and things like that, let's take a moment and talk about how religion develops in Egypt and how we can contrast that, interestingly enough, to the Mesopotamian view. Mesopotamians, remember, gloomy, gloomy, dark afterlife. They don't talk about it very much. The Egyptians are obsessed with the afterlife. Why so? Well, again, my initial theory that food surplus has a lot to do with it is relatively accurate for Egypt because they do have a relatively large food surplus. So anyway, you have this massive food surplus, so that's not something they have to worry about. So they develop a relatively positive outlook on life. Egypt, again, so that and the fact that they're not usually invaded by people very often is another benefit to their society. So they have a good view of life. Their view of the afterlife is fascinating. A number of important gods, goddesses, a very polytheistic religion, and one of the things they do, we're going to contrast this to the Greeks when I meet with you next week. Egyptian gods bear slight resemblance to humans. They are usually a hybrid of human and animal. In essence, blending the natural world, animal, with the human. So you're beginning to see humans to try to conceptualize what is divine, what is holy. Okay? And nature is always a pretty relatively sacrosanct, holy issue for earlier civilizations. That there is a reverence. Mesopotamians certainly had a reverence for nature. The Egyptians have a reverence for nature, but they're also beginning to work out mentally a reverence or at least an appreciation for their own humanity. And so you see some compilation of human and animal in the personification of their deities. And there's a number of important Egyptian gods and goddesses we should talk about. The first is a cat named Osiris. Osiris is Lord of the underworld. When you die, and there is a story that Osiris, who was married to Isis, who is, by the way, his sister as well. Another interesting phenomenon in a lot of ancient religions is they're trying to play out this concept of gods and man and the relationship between the two. You see a lot of interesting incestuous relationships between gods, and that runs through a lot of mythology. Osiris and Isis are brother and sister. They have a child, Horus. Osiris also has a brother. His name was Seth. Seth eventually killed Osiris, chopped him into itty-bitty pieces, scattered the pieces all over the place. And his wife Isis goes running around, gathers up all the pieces, puts Osiris back together. And Osiris is Lord of the underworld. And as Lord of the Underworld, when you die, you pass through an elaborate series of gates and rituals and things in order to gain passage to the underworld. Much of that is written in something referred to as the Book of the Dead. The Book of the Dead is this elaborate, interesting Egyptian mythology story. And what's really interesting about Egyptian mythology and the concept that Osiris, as Lord of the Dead, judges you, it's really one of the first accounts, and much religion will follow this idea, that what you do in life counts towards your either punishment or reward after you die. Now, some would argue that this also has a fascinating, interesting relationship to the temporal world, in that the people who manage religion, which is usually the priestly caste, which is usually under some sort of king or nobility, religion is often used as an element of social control. So if they tell you if you do X, Y, and Z while you're alive, it's going to count for eternity. Eternity is a long time, right? So authorities often use religion as a mechanism to tell people to behave, obey the rules, obey the laws, do what you need to do, be a good person, and a good person doesn't break the rules, and therefore you get this eternal reward. And really the Egyptians, through their leaders and their priestly caste, are among the first to tell us that what happens in life matters for eternity. Okay? And so anyway, you die, you go before Osiris, and Osiris will pass some sort of judgment on you, and you either get into this interesting, very nice afterlife, or a really bad afterlife. And again, very early conceptualizations of what we will later visualize as some sort of heaven and hell type issue is kind of being played out by these early civilizations and the Egyptians' visions of a very positive afterlife or a very gloomy, dark, painful afterlife, depending again on what you did while you were alive. The Egyptians also believed that the afterlife was so rich and so important that physically, as you appeared in death, so your body appeared for all eternity. That led to the Egyptian practice of mummification. The Egyptians were huge practitioners of mummification, that the body needed to be preserved. So when you died, they would take out your organs because you would rot, and what they did is they had a fascinating instrument that would go up your nose, down into your body, and they would yank your internal organs out through your nose. How about that? And then they would season the body with spices and oils and things like that and wrap it up and preserve it. Okay? And then bury it, of course, in one of the great issues of Egyptian civilization. They are the first really great monument builders. And their monuments are important to us for a number of reasons. The Mesopotamians built monuments, tombs. They were called ziggurats. And a ziggurat was kind of a step pyramid. The Egyptians, however, were the very first civilization in human history to work in stone. Okay, why was stone so important? Well, unlike mud or other building materials that other previous civilizations, like the Mesopotamians, used, stone's permanent. Okay, stone leaves a lasting monument. And we know that because we still have many of these Egyptian monuments, the pyramids. I've been to Egypt twice in my life, seen them. If you've never been there and seen them up close and personal, you can't really understand the enormity of the pyramids. And to understand how a civilization without the wheel, without modern tools, without computers, without any of that stuff, were able to build such magnificent structures, really allows us to, again, gain some interesting perspective on the fact that these are not, as some would argue, primitive civilizations. These are amazingly advanced civilizations trying to do many of the same things that we try to do today. Understand the basic rationale and reason for our existence. And one of the other interesting aspects of Egyptian society, Egyptian culture, and we'll contrast this later to the Greeks, who really are, the Greeks and Romans are primarily the major influences, movers and shakers of Western civilization. Why isn't it Egypt? Why don't we base our gods on Egyptian models? Why don't we base our society on Egyptian models, blah, blah, blah. One of the more interesting aspects of Egyptian society, and I may ask this on a quiz, and we may talk about it in discussion at some point in time. One of the hallmarks of Egyptian civilization is its incredible resistance to change. Egyptian society, which is thousands of years old, in the Old, Middle, and New Kingdom periods, does not change fundamentally, substantially, in a lot of ways. Relatively speaking, the gods are the same. Relatively speaking, the power structure is the same. Relatively speaking, the economic structure is the same. For some reason, the Egyptians did not embrace change. Now, we're going to contrast that this next week to the Greeks, who are, by all accounts, incredibly embracing of change. They love change. So that's going to be an important issue. If there's one thing that really defines contemporary Western civilization, it is our adaptability and fondness for consistent change. That is in direct contrast to the Egyptians, who, for some reason, were remarkably resistant to change. So what we're going to do now, that's kind of enough of the lecture material for this week. I have a video for you to watch. We will see a lot of these videos throughout the term. The Engineering and Empire series, which talks about some of the fascinating cultural and architectural and technological achievements of many of the civilizations we're going to talk about this term. The Egyptians, the Persians, the Romans, the Greeks, the Carthaginians, fascinating peoples who, and again, as I said before, one of the big takeaways is that these are not primitive civilizations. These are highly advanced, technologically, for their day, cutting-edge type cultures. So we'll watch that. Then I'll have another brief little video session on what you should do for the discussion questions this week, some topics you might want to bring up, and then that will be it for the week, and then I will very much look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks for being here. Bye-bye.